Welcome back to this series of Dark Reading Fast Chats. Terry Sweeney here, contributing editor to Dark Reading. Joining me now is Chris Kirsch, CEO and co-founder of RunZero. Chris, thanks for joining us today on this Dark Reading Fast Chat.
Thanks for having me.
We, of course, are talking about asset discovery, an important topic in the security realm in these recent months and weeks. Help us understand, why is it that asset discovery is still so difficult for organizations to do effectively or even moderately well?
Yeah, coming into this area, I was surprised myself because I thought that this would have been a problem that's long solved, but it turns out it's not. And it's not only immature companies from a security perspective, it's also the very mature ones. I think the challenge is that a lot of companies are approaching this from an IT point of view. So they're thinking, oh, I'll install an agent on a device, or I'll install, or I'll log onto the device through a username and password. But, there are a lot of IoT devices and unmanaged devices on the network that you can't cover with that. Like you can't cover your Polycom phone and so on. You can't cover like a test box. And it's really those kind of devices that people were worried about. But even further than that, if we just, replay the last few years of what's been happening in the information technology world, we've added the cloud. With the pandemic came the cloud and remote work.
Complicates things tremendously.
Right? Complicates things a ton. And then also IT security teams were increasingly being asked to also cover OT security. So OT is operational security. So think of like manufacturing floors or utilities or hospital wards, with all the biomedical devices. And so when you think about those, like a pure IT approach just no longer works.
Makes sense. I get the sense as well, though, that so while companies may have things like vulnerability scanners or endpoint protection software in place, that they may have the misperception that they don't need asset discovery because these other things handle that. Is that accurate, or is that maybe not a complete understanding?
Well, if you don't know what you have, you don't even know where to install your endpoint protection software, right? Sure. So one huge use case for our customers is actually to tell them, tell me all of the Windows devices or all of the servers that I don't have my EDR agent on, or do I have all of my parts of the network covered with my vulnerability scanner? We've got some customers who thought they had only 2 networks, and it turns out they have 40 different networks that they're, that they have in their environment. That's because of mergers and acquisitions and layers of system admins who've added stuff over the years, or even the users, the departments themselves that add equipment to the network.
Right. So another element has, I guess, made its presence felt on the landscape. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, aka CISA, recently issued a directive for federal agencies. For viewers who may not be familiar with this recent directive from CISA, can you help us just summarize the substance of what they're asking for there?
Sure. So for folks who want to look this up, it's got the thrilling name of Binding Operational Directive 2301. And it basically is asking demanding all of the federal civilian agencies to do 2 things. Number 1, have a vulnerability management program, and number 2, have an asset inventory program. And this is really important because it's so foundational to all of your security programs. For example, the NIST cybersecurity framework says, number 1 is asset inventory. CIS benchmark says number 1 is asset inventory. So you can't really build a security program on top if you don't have that basis.
So it seems like you might be suggesting that some federal agencies may not be at the top of their game where asset discovery and management is concerned. Help us paint the picture for us, if you will.
I think the agencies are probably struggling from similar things that some of the other organizations of their size, suffer from. So first of all, they're often trying to use secondary data from their, for example, vulnerability scanners or EDR agents to infer an asset inventory. But as we said, like if you don't have an EDR agent on every device, you're missing things, right? So you don't have a good cross check. Often vulnerability scanners only cover part of the network. They are also not very good at actually telling you what a device is. So with one customer, there was the vulnerability scanner told them it was like a Linux 2618 device, something like that. And we saw that it was I think it was a load balancer of a specific brand and of a specific model with firmware number and so on. So both of them were correct, but our version of the truth was a lot more specific and a lot more helpful in helping them figure out what this is. And so what CISA is recommending is that you take a combination of a few things. So first of all, they say, most likely the right path for scanning for asset inventory is without special privileges. That's the best case, what they have in the regulation. And that is because without having any login information, that makes sure that you cover all of your bases and that you cover all of the IoT devices, et cetera, et cetera. You do need a scanner that's purpose built for that really performs well and actually tells you what it's scanning so that you can have a proper asset inventory. So that's number one of what it requires. And then you also need an integration through APIs for your virtualized environment. So that's cloud in particular, right? And when you combine those two, API plus unauthenticated scanning, you really get to the full breadth and depth of your asset inventory. There are a few other areas in CISA that are interesting. For example, it sets certain timelines of how quickly you have to do things. So full asset inventory every 7 days, right? So
wow. Okay.
That's oftentimes hard for a very large network. If you're thinking of looking at your entire, RFC 1918 space, so all of the IP internally routed IPv4 addresses, scanning all of that every 7 days is usually a challenge for the vulnerability scanners. So you need a scanner that can cover that in that time. And it gets even tighter because when you have a 0-day vulnerability, you have to reply back to CISA within 72 hours on whether you have that vulnerability, right? But if we think back to Log4j, the vulnerability management vendors, they took about 2 weeks to even come up with a vulnerability check because there was so many different applications that were affected. And then you had to download that vulnerability check, you had to rescan your network, and you had to and only then after you have after you rescan the network in your maintenance window, then you have the information of what systems are vulnerable. To get to that timeline of 72 hours, what we recommend is having a really good asset inventory that you've already scanned, and it's at least or at the most it's 7 days old, and then you can query that database with a specific question. So show me all of the SolarWinds boxes, show me all of the Exchange servers, Confluent servers, all of the PAX payment terminals, anything that might be vulnerable or backdoored, something specific that you're looking for. And then you get the answer in seconds. So it's really decoupling that scanning and assessment, those two steps. Instead of having that in one step, scanning and assessment, you scan and do the assessment later.
Right. Well, so with that in mind, so querying the data that's generated from these weekly asset discovery scans has obvious importance and really improves the security and manageability of a network. What else can you do with that data from the discovery scans?
Sure. So there's a bunch of things you can do. I talked about security controls coverage. So figuring out where you have endpoint protection, MDM, vulnerability scan. You can find risky assets, not only things with vulnerabilities, but also, for example, let's say a remote desktop that's open on a public port, or a device that's bridging a sensitive network with a regular maybe a guest network with a sensitive network or something like that. Somebody's got the Wi-Fi on and the hardwired network, and it's creating a bridge between those. But also one thing that's actually often overlooked but super important is figuring out who the owner is of an asset. If we think back, this is like an old example, but the truth only came out a few years later with Equifax. They actually knew that this particular server had a particular vulnerability, but they had an outdated or wrong record of who this asset belonged to. So when they were emailing somebody to fix it, they emailed the wrong person. And that's why it didn't get fixed in time. So asset inventory with ownership and all of the additional information that you gain from that is something really foundational to just, be able to respond to whatever you find, whether it's a vulnerability or an affected device. So for example, we had a proof of concept with let's call it an amusement park recently, and they saw traffic going to China from a certain IP address from inside the network, but they didn't know what that device was. So they looked at Run Zero and they said, "Oh, this is an IP camera from a relatively notorious Chinese manufacturer." And so they said, "All right, this is a no-go. We're going to take this off the network. We're not comfortable with that because that's a point of presence that's communicating to an external party that could then be used to pivot into other networks internally."
Well, Chris, you make a strong case for more completeness and greater accuracy with regard to asset discovery and the scan data that results from those. Really appreciate you joining us for this Dark Reading Fast Chat today.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Chris Kirsch, the CEO and co-founder of Run Zero. This has been Terry Sweeney for Dark Reading. Thanks for joining us for today's Fast Chat. We'll see you next time.